I told you that big things were coming, and Bibi Netanyahu has not disappointed. $110 billion is now being invested into Israel's weapons production, and I cannot overestimate the significance of this decision. Israel is going independent over the next decade, and I don't want to say I told you so, but I so did. According to Netanyahu, this enormous decision came from a need to reduce our dependence on all players, including friends. He is, of course, referring here to the United States, who has massively enabled our military capabilities. Is this a good or a dangerous move, potentially angering our greatest ally? Or is this the dawn of a new day for Israel? As always, we will break it all down. This is the Mira K Show on JNS TV. Let's start from the very beginning. As always, we need the context because without the history, we are not going to understand why this move makes such a big difference. I'm going to take you back to a starry night in 1947 where the state of Israel was about to be declared. The tension was palpable and the fear absolutely enormous. It was clear to all that if the declaration from the UN came through, the Arab countries around us would fight, as would the Arabs within the country. And Israel has a problem, as almost no countries would supply us with arms to avoid fueling a potential conflict. Specifically, the US and Britain, who, surprise, surprise, didn't have a problem providing the Arab countries with tanks and planes, basically put us under an embargo. So, what did Israel do? We have an enormous war to fight and no way to do so. Well, interestingly enough, Czechoslovakia, with Stalin's approval, agrees to sell Israel leftover Nazi German weapons for cash. They arrive in a massive airlift under Operation Balak. And to think of young Israelis who have just survived the Holocaust fighting against the Arabs with rifles that still had Nazi logos on them is just an unbelievable. The fact that we survived this war was a miracle in and of itself. I mean, did you know that we set up fake movie studios in what's known as the lipstick smuggling network for machinery that could create bullets, or used underground factories to create mortars, i.e., bombs, that basically didn't work but made such loud noise that the enemies were petrified? Anyway, we didn't really have the actual things that we needed to win, and I could geek out about the details of all the things that Israel did to protect itself back then without the military abilities, but this episode will never end, so let's refocus. It was a hard time for a struggling country, and honestly, it was a win that no one anticipated. To think that it was Russia that helped us to survive is kind of nuts, especially given the fact that the arms that they gave us were truly utter junk. But it is after this war that Israel realized it's going to need strong friends to help us defend ourselves, and it sets out to build diplomatic relationships to procure arms. In fact, right away, they find a new ally, and by 1967, we have a really strong ally in place, surprisingly, France. For 15 years, they had been providing us with a very modern air force supplied almost entirely by them. Why was France suddenly our best friend? Well, as often the case with allied countries, it was our shared enemy that united us. To them, Egypt was a problem. And for Israel, of course, being on their border, we knew that Egypt was a serious threat. France had wanted to take on Arab nationalism for quite a while because they were causing many different issues in their colonies and realized that Israel could potentially be a good partner in that. But when the war between the rebels in Algeria against France ended, the French started to have a change of heart. They suddenly wanted to make friends with these Arab countries because of all of the oil. And yes, you guessed right, they decided to throw Israel under the bus to obtain that. Just 3 days before the Six Day War, the famous Six Day War, started, the French president de Gaulle imposed a total arms embargo on Israel in hopes of getting them to not preempt the war, something that there was a lot of whispers about. This, of course, didn't work, and Israel successfully, in one of the most astounding military feats of all time, used the air force that they had already been given and took out the majority of Egypt's air force on one bright morning in a war that lasted just 6 days. People often miss this part of the miracle. Had the war drawn out even a bit longer, Israel would not have had any of the arms that it needed because of this embargo. The French betrayal of Israel wasn't just in the arms issue. It was also in the fact that we had paid them for many more arms that they refused to send to us, keeping both the money and the products. Remember, we're a young state with little money or almost no money, But we did have brains. And so, what did we decide to do about those 12 missile boats they refused to send to us? Well, on Christmas Eve of 1969, a year after the war had ended, Israeli sailors disguised as tourists sneaked onto the boats, fired up the engines, and sailed them out of France into a raging winter storm while the French government was on holiday. And they made it to Israel. I mean, we had paid for those boats, but we had also paid for 50 planes. And with the planes in our possession starting to die out, we needed them. But France adamantly refused. Manufacturing seemed like the most obvious way forward, but we needed the know how, i.e., the blueprints. How are we going to get that? Well, Israel launched a daring intelligence operation to steal the means of its own survival. The Mossad recruited a Swiss engineer at a company licensed to build the Mirage engines, the plane engines, who managed to smuggle over 2 tons of classified blueprints to Israel by swapping out the crates destined for the incinerator with old newspapers. Using those stolen plans, Israel's aerospace industries first cloned these engines to create the Nesher, our first real plane, which proved critical in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, shooting down over 100 of our enemy's planes. They then radically engineered the design by stuffing a massive American engine into this French airframe to create what we now know as the Kfir. It's a Frankenstein jet that was faster than the original and birthed Israel's modern high-tech defense industry. This betrayal taught Israel a lot, and really in many ways started the beginning of us creating our own defense systems. But again, we didn't have the ability to truly become the military superpower that we needed to defend ourselves. And then enters the US. During this time, they're in the midst of dealing with a Russian threat, right? And looking at the Cold War map, they realize that maybe backing Israel isn't such a bad idea. After years of a cold shoulder, the US starts to send us proper military planes. Remember, we're on the border with Egypt and Syria, who were then backed by the Soviets. But we needed more than just an air force. We needed tanks and ammo, and having learned our lesson from the French, who betrayed us just like this, we decide to diversify. Yes, some still came from the Americans, but not directly. Out of fear of angering the Arab countries, they used Germany as a middleman to secretly provide us with American tanks under the German reparations for the Holocaust. We also brought some stuff from the UK, and in a really interesting twist of events, during the Six-Day War, about 5 years beforehand, Egypt and Syria had left hundreds of Soviet tanks, brand new, in the desert when we defeated them. We then went and took them over. We have, at this point, a mishmash of an army, which ends up proving to be a real issue come the Yom Kippur War, because the war took Israel completely by surprise. And to power the tanks that the UK had given us, we needed the right shells to fire. But they were petrified of facing an oil embargo as a potential consequence of siding with us, so they refused to send us anything. In a matter of days, we had almost no ammo. We couldn't use the Russian tanks, we couldn't use the UK tanks, and we were basically stuck. We had the tanks and planes, right? But none of the fuel or bullets. By the way, this is now the second time and comes back to why Israel's moving towards energy independence is so important. For those who don't get the reference, make sure to check out our previous episode on the oil deal Israel is doing with Egypt. Oil and military dependence come hand in hand, and countries make diplomatic decisions all the time based on their oil and trade needs. In the future, Israel will be able to stop countries from supporting our enemies because they can threaten their own oil embargoes on them. But one second, let's get back to the topic at hand. So we call on the US because it's the Yom Kippur War and we don't have the stuff that they need, and they, i.e. Nixon, decide to help. In what's known as Operation Nickelgrass, for 32 days they send us massive supplies to replenish our army, and it saves us. It isn't just shells, it's tanks and jets as well. But this comes with the ultimate price, the one that we are still familiar with till this day. It was golden handcuffs. It saved us, but when then they decided that the war needed to end for their own reasons, Israel was forced into a ceasefire. You see, within a few weeks, we had recovered from the surprise attack and had flipped the table completely. The Egyptians were surrounded in the desert with no supplies, but that didn't fit the plan the US had, hoping for a peace deal one day and knowing that if we really, really won, that would never happen. So they forced Israel to stop the war right in the middle and feed the Egyptians, or the supplies to Israel would stop. And here, Israel kind of learned the lesson that this money was going to come with some serious strings attached. And this just didn't work for us. The Israeli defense establishment went into a manic state of production. The logic was simple: if we build everything ourselves, no one can ever turn off the tap. It's a similar logic to what we're feeling now. For about 15 years, from 1974 to 1987, Israel tries to become a mini superpower. We are still buying a tremendous amount from the US, but we are also manufacturing our own. We build our own tanks, the Merkava. We build the Galil rifle, so we don't need Europe. And we also invest heavily in creating our own plane called the Lavi. The idea is not to be dependent on the US for jets, because we are still buying the F-15s and F-16s from them. But it turns out that the US didn't like this. They don't want us building competition. So they tell us to cut the Lavi plan in a super controversial move here in Israel in 1987. It hardly passes in the government. It's only one vote that gets this whole operation cancelled. But Israel had been investing in this for ages, and the whole country was really behind it. Again, Israel, for the second time, does something that is bad for the country in order to keep the money from the United States. But it brings the birth of something new and important. What was Israel going to do with the thousands of engineers and brilliant minds that had been working on this jet project? Israel doesn't want them to leave the country, so they pour money into new departments within the aerospace industry. Since they couldn't build the plane, they want the tech to build the smartest missiles, radars, and drones that maybe could potentially destroy other planes. And that's what Israel did. Very quickly, it moved into high tech, but for the military. The Iron Dome, the laser beams, and cyber. But it was more than that. We're building optimized technology, designs, and codes. Remember, most Israeli men are military trained. They have extensive understanding of the needs for the army. And so, in many ways, the Lavi ending comes and starts to be a bit of a blessing in disguise. But what actually happens to the manufacturing of the real parts? The bombs, the bullets, the tanks, etc. Well, here comes the golden handcuffs bit. The US introduces a program of financial aid. We're all familiar with it at this point. There's a big misconception that the aid that the US sends us is just a free gift, and we know that this is false. The money needs to be used in the United States. Well, actually, there's a small caveat. When the arrangement was first signed, they were sending about $3 billion a year, roughly half of which was economic aid, something that Israel gradually phased out. This deal is different from what we are now familiar with because they agreed to allow Israel to spend 25% of it in Israel. But I'm going to get to that in a second. America has very specific reasons it funds us, and all of them are majorly beneficial to them. These are the top 5. They have political interests in keeping a strong ally in the Middle East. The money we are given needs to be used in the US, which bolsters their economy. They can force our hand on military decisions that don't align with their interests. They receive in return some of the best tech and intelligence that only Israel can provide, and they stop us from becoming serious competition to them in the arms manufacturing business. What happens next is a very weird hybrid situation. The 25% that we could spend here up until 2016 was given so that Israel could build out the tech. Think of it as kind of like an apology for them making us cancel a V. I mean, imagine a kitchen with Israel making the recipes, but the ingredients are all in the United States. Take the Iron Dome, for example. The radar and software are made in Israel, but the manufacturing of the actual missiles is in the United States. Similar with the Merkava tanks. We build the whole thing, but the engine comes from America. It's a weird hybrid situation. And why? Well, with all the money that the US was giving Israel to spend there, it didn't make sense to use our own money on manufacturing here when it would be technically free for us to have them make it. Think about it like this. We need 100,000 artillery shells. Option number 1 with an Israeli factory costs 50 million shekels from the Israeli taxpayer budget. Option number 2, the American factory, costs 0 from the Israeli budget because it's paid for by the US credit. It's kind of pretty obvious. Our tech just keeps getting stronger and stronger, but our blue-collar production factories start to shut down slowly, slowly, slowly. In 2016, with Obama's deal, this really took a turn. You see, they announced a huge deal of $38 billion in aid over 10 years, but 100% of it now needed to be spent in the US. And we decided to take it. All $38 billion goes directly to military arms. None of it is now economic support, which was a big shift. I mean, the irony of this is also just completely insane. On one hand, we're exporting the best tech in the world, worth billions and billions and billions. But on the other hand, come a real war, we are completely dependent on the US for the actual arms to fight. And then comes October 7th, and Israel sees the serious issues with this. Yes, we have the best tech, but we don't have the bombs needed to fight or the bullets. And when Biden started to pause the shipments, we were in serious trouble. This dictated a huge amount of our war strategy and is a big part of why it took so long for us to get to the point that we're at now. And Bibi notices. And so, therefore, this is why this enormous announcement this week that for the next 10 years, $110 billion will be invested into our own manufacturing is so significant. It's about 15% of Israel's GDP. To put it into perspective, the aid that we received from the US over 10 years is about $38 billion. This is almost triple that. And whilst we don't yet know a huge amount of the deal, the reason for this is that Israel can be military self-sufficient even from our allies. We will still be buying some parts from other countries, but we are looking to build our independence. This is a deliberate shift as our concerns over future restrictions have proven to be legitimate. We saw the embargoes over the war, and it honestly can't continue. But it's not just making sure we don't have troubles in the future, it's actually going to enhance our operational secrecy and autonomy in conflicts and position us as a global arms exporter. Now, before you get too excited, it's important to note that this isn't happening tomorrow. This will take ages to actually get off the ground. Ages. And it's also no coincidence that this announcement was made just before Netanyahu's trip to Florida to meet with Trump. It will be used as a helping line for negotiations, which brings us really to the question of how the US is going to react. But there are other problems as well. Will the money be diverted from other critical national needs Israel might have? I mean, it's 50% of the GDP. Will it provoke other countries into a bit of an arms race as they get afraid of Israel's new enhanced capabilities? I mean, these are all questions we're going to need to ask. But truly, the most important question is, will this put us in a dangerous position with the US, as it will take time for us to become independent? And whilst I don't have the full answer, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Bibi didn't make such an enormous decision without having checked with his friends in the White House first. I mean, you have to understand what it takes for a $110 billion investment. This is not a small, simple announcement. There have been months and months of preparation to make this happen. And if I were to guess, I'd say that there are many people, even in the American administration, who are actually kind of happy for this. Look, we know that the current administration is our friends, but it is not always going to be the case. And as the winds blow against Israel, not just in the Democrat Party, but significantly in the Republican Party now as well, it wouldn't surprise me if some of our allies are secretly pushing for this to ensure Israel's long-term safety. In many ways, this is honestly a win politically for them. With stop foreign funding growing as a sentiment across the US, this may be a way to make those voters happy, but also ensure that Israel is protected against potential dangerous future administrations. I mean, I'm just going to say it. I think that the voters who think that this is a good idea are idiots. They just don't understand politics at all. This announcement is great for Israel. Yes, it's complicated, but it's not that good for the United States. They stand to lose a lot, but that's become the new norm. Uneducated people calling for things that actually are harmful to them. I mean, gays for Palestine. Anyone? As we've said multiple times, America actually gains a lot more from the funding of our military than Israel does. For Israel, yes, it's a survival mechanism, but in many ways it stops us from the things that we want. For America, it honestly just enhances their situation. But there's another reason that the timing of this is, again, strategic. Over the last few weeks, it has become clear that the US is planning on selling F-35s to Saudi Arabia in hopes to grow the Middle East anti-Iran alliance group. F-35s are like the most developed planes that we have at the moment. Saudi Arabia now has the same status as Israel, a major non-NATO ally. And we know that Trump's plan is for Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations, which is why Israel hasn't really tried to stop the sales of these planes. But it doesn't mean we're happy about it. And Turkey, by the way, is also trying to get back into the F-35 program, which could be a real issue for Israel. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because whilst we really aren't interested in potential enemy countries having very high-flying planes, Netanyahu is going to use this announcement as leverage to kind of fight back. How exactly? We don't know. But potentially, could he be negotiating for better planes or other military wins? Yes. It's important to note that the US has a law since 2008, which we call the QME, the qualitative military edge. The idea is that the US is legally required to keep Israel's military edge, meaning they cannot sell an Arab country in the Middle East anything equal to what Israel has. So, how are they going to be selling this plane to Saudi Arabia? Well, to begin with, they've kind of dumbed down the planes a little bit. But also, they have allowed Israel to modify and enhance the F 35s, and we're the only ones who can do so. This law doesn't run out like the money agreements we have with them that needs to be resigned every 10 years. This is a law. The US president cannot legally sell advanced arms to an Arab nation without first submitting a report to Congress certifying that Israel's edge remains safe. Now, why would they do this? A few reasons. As we have said, the US actually gains a lot from a strong Israel. For one, the Middle East is important for trade and oil. America doesn't want to fight wars and specifically wants to make sure that a massive war doesn't erupt, therefore disrupting trade. With a strong military edge, Israel serves as a deterrent, and the US doesn't need to deploy troops. Israel is also stable, unlike the other Arab countries that change overnight, and many of these countries have Soviet tendencies. This policy actually started back then when Egypt and Syria were backed by the Soviets. We are the pro-American country which isn't changing and could keep Soviet proxies at bay. Also, because of our wars, we are constantly improving their arms. We are contractually obligated to share the data with them, and so it's basically battle testing for free, keeping them with a military edge as well. And so here we are, at the beginning of a crossroads and a shift. Whilst we're so used to Israel and America's relationship being so interdependent and so positive in that way, we are seeing that things need to change. In last week's episode, we discussed how Bibi said that there are many, many more surprises, and honestly, he didn't disappoint. These lessons that we are learning have unfortunately been a long time coming, but I truly believed that the shifts we are seeing towards a more autonomous Israel, less dependent and unbelievably militarily and economically strong, are almost messianic. These are amazing times. True, many things can happen. True, it's not happening tomorrow, but it's the right track, and for a long time we felt that maybe we had lost our way. Maybe there wasn't much to be hopeful for, but this is not the case. Relationships evolve. The US and Israel's dynamic needs to shift from what used to be a very intense dependency into something that's much more on the same bar. Hopefully, even though there might be some growing pains, this will be good for everyone in the end. The doctrine of need, free aid, being dependent on others, just needs to be a thing of the past for Israel. It really does. Look at how many examples we presented in this episode, and there are many, many more that just prove how dangerous our dependency is. And now we're shifting away from needing others. But not just that, we're becoming powerful in our own right, moving towards countries becoming dependent on us. The Israel of 2023 will be unrecognizable from the Israel of 2033, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. The country is at the start of a boom, and I, for one, am so grateful to be living through these times. Remember, America as an ally is of utmost importance because at the end of the day, it is the West, the Judeo-Christian values that are going to be able and capable of fighting against the infiltrators to our economies and countries. We are seeing these infiltrations across the spectrum, and Israel's just the forefront. We fight the wars for America, and that relationship is always going to be connected. The question is, at what fault? At what point does Israel say, okay, back off a little bit? We can work together, but we cannot have our survival dependent on a president who might just end up hating us. And so if you're an American watching this episode and you're thinking, well, is this really bad for America? I'd say no. I'd say it's different. It's a shift. It's a shift away from the reality that we've known, which has had its benefits, but into something different. Something which, if you believe in Israel and you want Israel to survive, is actually massively, massively important for the future of our country. Both things can be true at the same time. Something can be good for Israel and good for America, and the relationship between these two countries is not going anywhere. As I said, this is going to take quite a bit of time for us to figure out. It is not happening tomorrow, but it is a correct and significant shift in the right direction. And finally, I've been waiting to do this episode for so long. I'm Ira Kay, and I will see you next time.